dedicated to journalists whose persistence hunting the facts makes possible our democracy. In 1838, Abraham Lincoln asked his fellow Americans, "At what point shall we expect the approach of danger? By what means shall we fortify against it? Passion has helped us, but can do so no more. It will in future be our enemy. Reason, cold, calculating, unimpassioned reason, must furnish all the materials for our future support and defense. Let those materials be molded into general intelligence, sound morality, and in particular a reverence for the Constitution and laws, and that we improve to the last, that we remained free to the last, that we revered his name to the last, that during his long sleep we permitted no hostile foot to pass over or desecrate his resting place. Shall be that which to learn, the last trump shall awaken our Washington." Posiwid, the purpose of a system is what it does. System theorists coined an acronym to separate beguiling beliefs from real-world facts. Rather than being seduced by what a system is intended to do, they focus on what it in fact does. Posiwid, the purpose of a system is what it does. In 1980, Saudi billionaire arms dealer Adnan Khashoggi's new super yacht named Nabila was one of the largest in the world. The Nabila was in the James Bond film Never Say Never Again. The super yacht was featured in a Queen song called Khashoggi's Ship. Who said that my party was all over? Ha ha, I'm in pretty good shape. The best years of my life are like a supernova. Ha ha, perpetual craze, I said that. Everybody drank my wine, you get my drift? And then we took a holiday on Khashoggi's ship. Well, we really had a good time. They was all so sexy. We was bad, we was blitzed. All in all, it was a pretty good trip. After Khashoggi ran into financial problems, he sold the yacht to the Sultan of Brunei, who in turn sold her to Donald Trump in 1988 for $29 million. After a refit, Mr. Trump renamed her Trump Princess. According to former Trump executive John R. O'Donnell, Mr. Trump sailed on it only once, its maiden voyage, from the Azores to the New York harbor. In his book Trump, Mr. O'Donnell said of the yacht, it so terrified him when they weighed anchor, the movement convinced him it was sinking, that he would never sleep on it. All the time it was docked at the marina, Mr. Trump went on board only to watch boat races or occasionally to entertain important customers or business associates. In 1991, Mr. Trump ceded his 281-foot super yacht Trump Princess over to creditors. The yacht was then purchased by Prince Al-Walid bin Talal bin Abdulaziz Al Saud, mogul and member of the Saudi royal family, who also happened to have a stake in another Trump property, the Plaza Hotel in New York. On the third day of the 1988 Republican Convention in New Orleans, Michael Caputo met Mr. Trump for the first time. Mr. Caputo said, "I liked the bars. Roger asked me to help him on an event for a businessman. I came over and set up chairs and waited for it to start, and I shook hands with Donald Trump as he walked in, and, pleasantries, and that was it." In 1974, when he was 8 years old, Felix Sater and his family emigrated from Moscow to Brighton Beach. According to the FBI, Mr. Sater's father, who was convicted for extorting local restaurants, grocery stores, and a medical clinic, was a boss for Semyon Mogilovich. Mogilovich wasn't feared because he was the most violent gangster, but because he was reputedly the smartest. Mr. Mogilovich ran drug trafficking and prostitution rings on an international scale. In one characteristic deal, he bought a bankrupt airline to ship heroin from Southeast Asia into Europe. He used a jewelry business in Moscow and Budapest as a front for art that Russian gangsters stole from museums, churches, and synagogues all over Europe. Mr. Mogilovich has also been accused of selling some $20 million in stolen weapons, including ground-to-air missiles and armored troop carriers, to Iran. The FBI said he uses this wealth and power to not only further his criminal enterprises, but to influence governments and their economies. According to defected Russian intelligence agent Alexander Litvinenkov, Mogilovich had a good relationship with Putin since 1994 or 1993. A year after he made that statement, Litvinenkov was dead, apparently poisoned by agents of the Kremlin. Felix Sater tried making it as a stockbroker, but his career came to an abrupt end in 1991 after he stabbed a Wall Street foe in the face with with a broken margarita glass during a bar fight, opening wounds that required 110 stitches. Years later, in a deposition, Mr. Trump downplayed the incident, insisting that Mr. Sater got into a barroom fight, which a lot of people do. Sater lost his trading license over the attack and served a year in prison. Even before the Taj opened in 1990, the New Jersey Casino Control Commission was concerned about the casino's viability given its rapidly escalating costs and considered revoking its operating license. Regulators closely monitored the financial performance of the Trump casinos and the developer's empire. Mr. Trump told the commission that he could rein in expenses because conventional lenders were lining up to give him money at low interest rates. Mr. Trump said he abhorred junk bonds because they carried a bigger risk of default and thus came with higher interest rates. Within months, he reversed course, issuing $675 million worth of junk bonds with a 14% interest rate to finish construction. Mr. Trump has said that with each financing, he took money out of the casinos to invest in Manhattan real estate. Total debt on the Taj Mahal exceeded $820 million. Less than 2 weeks before the casino opened, Marvin B. Rothman, a casino analyst at Janney Montgomery Scott, told the Wall Street Journal that the Taj would need to reap $1.3 million a day just to make its interest payments, a sum no casino had ever achieved. Mr. Rothman told the Journal, "The market just isn't there." Mr. Trump retaliated against the Philadelphia-based investment firm, demanding that they fire Mr. Rothman, and they did. Almost immediately, Mr. Trump had trouble making the debt payments on the Taj Mahal and his other casinos. It was also clear that the Taj Mahal was cannibalizing the Castle and the Plaza. Gambling revenues in Atlantic City flattened in 1990, rising by just 1.35% as gamblers grew more cautious in light of a national recession. In August 1990, New Jersey regulators noted the sheer volume of debt on Mr. Trump's holdings, $3.4 billion, $1.3 billion on the casinos, and $832.5 million in loans personally guaranteed by Mr. Trump. Regulators warned the possibility of a complete financial collapse of the Trump organization is not out of the question. The Taj Mahal missed its November debt payment. The castle was also late. Neither Trump's castle nor Mr. Trump had the necessary funds to make an $18.4 million bond payment due in December 1990. On December 17, 1990, Fred Trump dispatched Howard Snyder, a trusted bookkeeper, to Atlantic City with a $3.35 million check. Mr. Snyder bought $3.35 million worth of casino chips and left without placing a bet. Apparently, even this infusion wasn't sufficient, because that same day, Fred Trump wrote a second check to Trump's castle for $150,000, bank records show. With this ruse, it was an illegal $3.5 million loan under New Jersey gaming laws, resulting in a $65,000 civil penalty. Donald Trump narrowly avoided defaulting on his bonds. Just over a year after it opened, the Taj Mahal was in bankruptcy court, followed in 1992 by both the Plaza and the Castle. In bankruptcy court, Mr. Trump ceded to the lenders a 50% stake in the businesses in return for lower interest rates. The lenders agreed to defer certain payments and hold off on personal claims against Mr. Trump for 5 years. There was little to no reduction in the enormous debts. Mr. Trump's core business losses in 1990 and 1991, more than $250 million each year, were more than double those of the nearest taxpayers in the IRS information for those years. Michael Vendito, a lawyer specializing in high-profile Chapter 11 cases, said, "Chapter 11 is how you reshape and restructure a company that has problems. You can have a visceral reaction to the fact that this company has gone through Chapter 11 multiple times, but the bondholders look at it, and the alternatives are much, much worse." The repercussions Chapter 11 might have for creditors versus, say, liquidation. What is an empty casino sitting on the Atlantic City boardwalk worth? If it's operating and it's got cash flow and income, it may not be able to pay back every cent on the dollar, but the creditors are better off in the long run. Mr. Trump said, "Early on, I took a lot of money out of the casinos with the financings and the things we do. Atlantic City was a very good cash cow for me for a long time." H. Stephen Norton, a casino consultant, said, "When he went bankrupt, he not only cost bondholders money, but he hurt a lot of small businesses that helped him." Beth Rosser is still bitter over what happened to her father, whose company nearly collapsed when Trump took the casinos into bankruptcy. "It took 3 years to recover any money owed for the work," she said, and her father received only 30 cents on the dollar. Ms. Rosser, who took over running the family's business, said, Trump crawled his way to the top on the back of little guys, one of them being my father. The dissolution of the Soviet Union was a years-long process. It began in the late 1980s with growing unrest in the various constituent republics. It ended on December 26, 1991, when the Supreme Soviet voted to dissolve. Semyon Mogilievich's greatest talent, the one that placed him at the top of the Russian mob, was finding creative ways to cleanse dirty cash. According to the FBI, Mr. Mogilievich had laundered money through more than 100 front companies around the world and held bank accounts in at least 27 countries. In 1991, Semyon Mogilievich made a move that led directly to Trump Tower. That year, the FBI says, Mogilievich paid a Russian judge to spring a fellow mob boss, Vyacheslav Kirillovich Ivankov, from a Siberian gulag. If Mogilievich was the brains, Ivankov was the enforcer. Vor v zakon, or made man, infamous for torturing his victims and boasting about the murders he had arranged. In 1992, a year after Ivankov was released from prison, he headed to New York on an illegal business visa and proceeded to set up shop in Brighton Beach. Over the next 3 years, Mr. Ivankov oversaw the mob's growth from a local extortion racket to a multi-billion-dollar criminal enterprise. According to the FBI, Mr. Ivankov recruited 2 combat brigades of Special Forces veterans from the Soviet war in Afghanistan to run the mafia's protection racket and kill his enemies. Mr. Ivankov bought a Rolls-Royce dealership that was used, according to the New York Times, as a front to launder criminal proceeds. The FBI concluded that one of Ivankov's partners in the operation was Felix Komarov, an upscale art dealer who lived in Trump Plaza on 3rd Avenue. The feds wanted to arrest Mr. Ivankov, but he kept vanishing. One agent said he was like a ghost to the FBI. Agents spotted Mr. Ivankov meeting with other Russian crime figures in Miami, Los Angeles, Boston, and Toronto. FBI agents also found Mr. Ivankov made frequent visits to Trump Taj Mahal in Atlantic City, which mobsters routinely used to launder huge sums of money. James Moody, chief of the Bureau's organized crime section, said, "We were looking around. We had to go out and really beat the bushes, and then we found out that he was living in a luxury condo in Trump Tower." There is no evidence that Trump knew Ivankov personally, even if they were neighbors. But the fact that a top Russian mafia boss lived and worked in Trump's own building indicates just how much high-level Russian mobsters came to view the future president's properties as a home away from home. William R. Noje came to the Legal Aid Society in 1993 with now immigration judge Walter Rule, with a desire to provide legal services to low-income immigrants seeking to remain in the U.S. Mr. Noje helped to found the Legal Aid Society's immigration program, one of the only immigration legal services programs in Western New York. Bill Noje was an advocate for civil legal services for those who could not afford legal services. As assemblyman, he advocated for increasing funding for civil legal services across New York. All County Building Supply and Maintenance, a company formed by the Trump family in 1992, was to be the purchasing agent for Fred Trump's buildings, buying everything from boilers to cleaning supplies. Instead, records and interviews show, All County siphoned millions of dollars by marking up purchases already made. The millions of dollars then flowed to All County's owners, Donald Trump, his siblings, and a cousin. Fred Trump then used the padded All County receipts to justify bigger rent increases for thousands of tenants. Mr. Trump was still personally responsible for more than $100 million in debt, and his agreements had only delayed the day of reckoning to June 30th, 1995. First, he shifted much of his personal debt onto his casinos, then onto a new group, shareholders. In 1993, his company sold more junk bonds, adding another $100 million in debt. More than half of the new money went to pay off Mr. Trump's unrelated personal loans. In June 1995, with the risk of being forced into bankruptcy just weeks away, Mr. Trump shifted ownership to a new publicly traded company, Trump Hotels and Casino Resorts. In the initial public offering, 10 million shares were sold at $14. At the same time, the company also sold another $155 million in junk bonds at a 15.5% interest rate. Becoming a public company burdened Mr. Trump with the responsibility of putting shareholders' interests first. But Mr. Trump, the largest shareholder and chairman of the board, could generally meet that obligation by obtaining approval from his board of directors and disclosing financial details in securities filings. The board's 3 outside members were widely seen as bowing to his wishes. A week after the initial public offering, the new company began using some of the almost $300 million it had raised to clear Mr. Trump's personal debts. During his financial pinch 2 years earlier, Chemical Bank had forced Mr. Trump to give up his ownership of the Trump Regency, a hotel next to the Trump Plaza. Mr. Trump held an option to buy it back for $60 million, which included debt on the hotel and $35.9 million that he personally owed the bank from his purchase of a Manhattan property. The new company exercised that option, in effect transferring Mr. Trump's debt to its own balance sheet. Donald J. Trump declared a $916 million loss on his 1995 income tax returns, a tax deduction so substantial it could have allowed him to legally avoid paying any federal income taxes for up to 18 years. In 1996, the public company issued more stock and sold $1.1 billion in junk bonds. The money was used in part to pay off $330 million in bonds on the plaza that had been guaranteed by a company Mr. Trump controlled, as well as almost $30 million that Mr. Trump personally owed to 2 banks. The company also bought the Trump Taj Mahal and Trump Castle, soon renamed the Trump Marina, shifting more of Mr. Trump's debt to shareholders. Some analysts and the stock market saw the $525 million that the public company had paid for the castle as too much. Stock began a long slide, falling from about $35 a share for the sale to $12 months later. Shareholders sued, alleging that the castle's purchase price, which included roughly $175 million in cash to Mr. Trump's private holding company, had been a gross and unjustified sweetheart deal for Mr. Trump. He later settled the suit. Mr. Trump received $1 million a year. In 1996, he was paid a $5 million bonus. The company posted losses of $66 million in 1996, $42 million in 1997, and $40 million in 1998. Mr. Trump and his siblings gained ownership of most of their father's empire on November 22, 1997, a year and a half before Fred Trump's death. The Trumps dodged hundreds of millions in gift taxes by submitting tax returns that grossly undervalued the properties, claiming they were worth just $41.4 million. The same set of buildings would be sold off over the next decade for more than $662 million. In 1998, Mr. Trump still personally owed $13.5 million to Donaldson, Lufkin, and John Rett, the investment bank that had underwritten the initial public offering in 1995. Under the terms of that loan, he was in danger of defaulting because the stock price of Trump hotels and casino resorts had fallen so low. A default would have made him lose control of the company. Instead, the casino company lent him the money to pay back the bankers. A shareholder sued, accusing the board of directors of breaching its fiduciary responsibility. The lawsuit, filed in 1999, said Trump Hotels and Casino Resorts is a casino and entertainment company. It is not in the business of loaning money. The company desperately needed and needs cash to shore up its deteriorating financial condition. Suit was dropped in 2000, shortly after Mr. Trump paid the company back. Throughout the 1990s, untold millions from the former Soviet Union flowed into Mr. Trump's luxury developments and Atlantic City casinos. But all the money wasn't enough to save Trump from his own failings as a businessman. Fortunately for Mr. Trump, his own economic crisis coincided with one in Russia. In 1998, Russia defaulted on $40 billion in debt, causing the ruble to plummet and Russian banks to close. The ensuing financial panic sent the country's oligarchs and mobsters scrambling to find a safe place to put their money. October 1998, just 2 months after the Russian economy went into a tailspin, Mr. Trump broke ground on his biggest project yet. Rising to 72 stories in Midtown Manhattan, Trump World Tower would be the tallest residential building on the planet. Former Secretary General Kofi Annan, AIDS researcher Mathilde Krim, Paul Newman, Kurt Vonnegut, and scores of other East Side residents had unsuccessfully petitioned the city to block the construction on the grounds of its proximity to the United Nations. Retired broadcast journalist Walter Cronkite decried the proposed 72-story Trump World Tower as a monstrosity. Walter Cronkite asked, "How can we allow an institution as important to New York as the United Nations be forever dwarfed?" Construction got underway in 1999, just as Trump was preparing his first run for the presidency on the Reform Party ticket, and concluded in 2001. Bloomberg Businessweek reported that it wasn't long before 1/3 of the units on the tower's priciest floors had been snatched up, either by individual buyers from the former Soviet Union or by limited liability companies connected to Russia. Trump World Tower's sales agent, Deborah Stott, said, "We had big buyers from Russia and Ukraine and Kazakhstan. Trump had found his market." After Trump World Tower opened, Sotheby's International Realty teamed up with a Russian real estate company to make a big sales push for the property in Russia. The tower full of oligarchs, as Bloomberg called it, became a model for Mr. Trump's projects going forward. All he needed to do, it seemed, was slap the Trump name on a big building, and high-dollar customers from Russia and the former Soviet republics were guaranteed to come rushing in. Dolly Lenz, a New York real estate broker, told USA Today that she sold some 65 units in Trump World Tower to Russians. Ms. Lenz said, "I had contacts in Moscow looking to invest in the United States. They all wanted to meet Donald." In January 1997, Zurab Siteli swept through the skylit studio as he proudly described how he is single-handedly transforming Moscow's cityscape. It was Mr. Siteli who designed the sprawling war memorial in Polknaya Gora, and it is Mr. Siteli who is building the bronze doors for the Cathedral of Christ the Savior. But it is his 15-story monument to Peter the Great jetting up from an island in the Moscow River that has this city abuzz. The Sitelization of Moscow, not crime, pollution, or the mind-numbing traffic jams, is the talk of the town. The mayor of Moscow, Yuri M. Luzkov, has backed the monument as a bold effort to recover Russia's past glory. But the writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn spoke for a growing chorus of critics when he derided Mr. Siteli's monuments as a case of Moscow being recklessly disfigured. The debate over Mr. Siteli's art has even spilled over to America, where Donald J. Trump has proposed building a 30-story Siteli monument to Christopher Columbus in his new project along the Hudson River. That plan has brought snickers from aides to Mayor Rudolph W. Giuliani, who said they were determined to prevent the Sitelization of New York. The man at the heart of this growing contretemps over Moscow's search for un-Soviet symbols is a prolific artist, natural charmer, and energetic entrepreneur who epitomizes all the contradictions of the new Russia. Mr. Siteli is a recipient of the Lenin Prize, who got his start designing state-owned resorts and hotels. Like the former communist officials who now govern capitalist Russia, the Georgian-born Mr. Siteli is well-connected and ideologically flexible. Was it true that Siteli and Trump had discussed erecting on the Hudson River a statue of Christopher Columbus that was 6 feet taller than the Statue of Liberty? "Yes, it's already been made, from what I understand," said Trump, who had met Siteli a couple months earlier in Moscow. "It's got $40 million worth of bronze in it, and Zurab would like it to be at my West Side Yards development, a 75-acre tract called Riverside South, and we are working towards that end." According to Trump, the head had already arrived in America. The rest of the body was still in Moscow, and the whole thing was being donated by the Russian government. The mayor of Moscow had written a letter to Rudy Giuliani stating that they would like to make a gift of this great work by Zurab. "I am absolutely favorably disposed toward it. Zurab is a very unusual guy. The man is major and legit." A favorite saying that Roy learned at a young age: scratch the back of a reformer and you find a thief. Mr. Trump briefly considered running for president on the Reform Party ticket. "The only thing that could interest me is if I could win," Trump said. "I'm not talking about the nomination. I'm talking about the whole Megillah." Trump learned that his best shot was to run as a populist. He said, "I think the kind of people who support me are the workers, the construction workers, the taxi cab drivers. Rich people don't like me." Backers of the Inquirer, Trump said, were his natural followers. "Those are the real people," he said. "That is the Trump constituency." He damned the Republicans. "The Republican Party has just moved too far to the extreme right," he said. He reserved his greatest ire for Pat Buchanan. "He's a Hitler lover," Mr. Trump said on NBC's Meet the Press. "He doesn't like the blacks. He doesn't like the gays." Citing parties he'd been invited to by Puff Daddy, Trump said, "I am just very popular with the black populace." Roger Stone's preternaturally youthful face. Mr. Stone credits decades of following a regimen of Chinese herbs, breathing therapies, Tai Chi, and acupuncture, in which he learned personality types correspond to a specific organ. Roger Stone is a kidney. He says that means he's aggressive. For all his eccentricities, Mr. Stone is nothing if not resilient. In September 1996, soon after the lurid sex revelations about Dick Morris, the Democratic consultant, the National Enquirer wrote that Mr. Stone, then a volunteer spokesman for Senator Bob Dole, had placed ads and photographs seeking sexual partners for himself and his second wife, Nydia. Mr. Stone denied the stories, saying the ads had been placed by a former domestic helper who had stolen photographs and his checkbook. He bowed out of the Dole campaign. Of that time, Mr. Stone says now, with a thin smile, "An awful lot of people left me for dead after that, but I'm still here." Mr. Stone is an exuberant negative campaigner, known for drawing journalists to seamy rumors. As a Nixon fan and a volunteer for the committee to re-elect the president, he donated money to the presidential primary campaign of a Republican challenger using the name of a left-wing group, and then mailed the receipt to a newspaper. In 1989, for local New Jersey Republicans, he designed a direct mail piece with government-style writing that said, "Important tax information enclosed." It warned homeowners that their taxes had doubled, courtesy of the Democrats. A conventional politician would pull his hair out, but we love it. Attention, for better or worse, was paid. He professes little interest in the mainstream candidates, although he keeps his 4 Washington Rolodexes spinning for his corporate clients. "As long as Mr. Trump is in the race," Mr. Stone said, by way of understatement, "we're not going to bore anyone to death." In 1994, Michael Caputo helped to found the Florence Group, one of the first Western-style public relations agencies in Russia. The business model was to provide election advice and campaign strategy to Russian candidates who would be elected to the Duma, or the Federation Council, and expand on those contacts to help American companies entering the Russian market. Mr. Caputo said, "It was a model that worked well. It was a model in the 80s that was working pretty well here, or in the 90s. It was working pretty well here." I had a very specific specialty. Amway, when they decided they wanted to come into the market, there was no law on multi-level marketing. So because I had that experience writing the Russian election law, and law being at the passage, I kind of leveraged that experience to help Amway draft a multi-level marketing law, and then to lobby that to passage. G-Tech, at the time, the world's largest online lottery company, wanted to get the Russian online lottery contract. There was no law on online lottery. I did a very similar job for them. Most of my American clients were involved in businesses that had no footing in Russia, so it was my job to not just help them find office space, but for them to get headspace in the Duma, in the Federation Council, in the Kremlin. Because you would try and explain Amway to a Russian in 1994, they'll look at you like you're crazy, and that was my model. I don't know how many elections I worked on there, frankly. I tried to count them before I came here, but it was a couple of dozen. I traveled around the country to do it. I worked in the North Pole, I worked in the farthest parts of Siberia, and I was in my 30s. It was a very exciting time. Paris in the 1920s, but with Kalashnikovs. I enjoyed it very much. Unfortunately, in 1998, when they devalued the ruble, every single one of my international clients left the market. I tried to change my model to serving Russian candidates in the Russian government. It wasn't 1998 till 2000, I struggled. I couldn't get up with anything at all. I ended up trying to help the Russian government raise money for their World's Fair presentation in Lisbon. Mr. Caputo commented, "That's how far afield of politics I got, because there was just no work." And in 2000, I came home for a New Year's Eve celebration, and then caught on television a New Year's Eve speech by Boris Yeltsin. Vladimir Putin was going to be the head of Russia. In February 2000, Mr. Trump concluded that Ross Perot's Reform Party, whose support he had sought, was so beset by internal fighting that he would have no chance of winning the White House as its nominee. Mr. Trump said, "I have consistently stated that I would spend my time, energy, and money on a campaign, not just to get a large number of votes, but to win. There would be no other purpose other than winning for me to run. I have therefore decided not to seek the presidential nomination of the Reform Party." He said that although his book and his businesses had probably benefited from the exposure his campaign had generated, I did not launch my exploratory campaign for that reason. Mr. Trump said, "For those who suggest that this has been just a promotion, I want to strongly deny that. Mr. Trump painted a fairly dark picture of the Reform Party in his statement, noting the role of Mr. Buchanan along with the roles of David Duke, a former leader of the Ku Klux Klan, and Lenora Fulani, the former standard-bearer of the New Alliance Party and an advocate of Marxist-Leninist politics. Mr. Trump said in a statement, the Reform Party now includes a Klansman, Mr. Duke, a neo-Nazi, Mr. Buchanan, and a communist, Ms. Fulani. This is not company I wish to keep. In the 1970s in New York City, reckless regulators under Mayor Beam were running the show, resulting in municipal bonds worth less than Confederate money. I learned from experiences like that just how hard it is for normal, sane, earnest Americans to make their dreams come true when they have to confront mule-headed but powerful Burons, a Buron being defined as a cross between a bureaucrat and a moron. In my opinion, Burons are opportunity destroyers. They're guilty of what I call Dreamicide. In the Brooks Brothers riot of the 2000 election recount, Roger Stone led a squad of pro-Bush protesters to storm the Miami-Dade County Election Board, stopping the recount and advancing then-Governor George W. Bush one step closer to the White House.